supposed to introduce you to. Maybe it's not your first time to deliver lecture to in Sudanese Surgical Club. Huh? So our expectations are very high because it's very important topic for surgeon and for physicians also.
Agree, sir.
Yeah. And so we may start our your lecture, and we know that parenteral nutrition is very important method, interventional method to treat patients and to enhance recovery in malnourished patients and patients who are supposed to recover faster from surgery. Little bit complicated topic, and it needs a multidisciplinary approach. The contribution of the pharmacists, dietitian, surgeons, and our expectations are high, and we are very sure that you are going to make us happy by the end of this topic. Please, Doctor.
Yes. Thank you, sir. Sir, if I may, can I start the session, sir?
Yes, now you can start.
Okay. So again, I'm glad to be part of this initiative of from Sudanese Surgical Club. So as Dr. Walid has already spoken, it is probably one of the important topics that we need to be aware, because as surgeons, what we generally concentrate is on choosing the patient, evaluating them with respect to the disease process, then trying to refine our own techniques, try to choose the appropriate medications post-operatively, including antibiotics. But somehow, with all these factors having an impact on the outcomes, the critical component of surgical nutrition is, I think, is often kept at the last part when it comes to managing patients. But its role in having a good outcome can never be underestimated. So today we'll be having a discussion on surgical nutrition. So the first half will be on the general concepts of surgical nutrition, and the second half I will try to be dwelling more on parenteral nutrition. So it is part of our daily routine. We see so many patients day in and day out who come to our OPD with some minor illnesses, say probably acid peptic disease and probably fissure in narrow or hemorrhoids. At the other extreme, we do have patients who are really moribund. They come to us in emergency with already pre-existing comorbidities and probably a significant component of malnourishment which is already existing. So even on a day-to-day practice, we do find quite a huge spectrum of patients. And given the spectrum, it is very important for us to identify these, first be aware of the spectrum, and also tailor our approach so that the entire spectrum gets benefited out of our surgical initiative. A patient who is walking into our clinic probably for an elective surgery is different from a patient who is going to be in the emergency department, who's having probably an diffuse peritonitis due to an hollow viscous perforation, and they cannot be managed with the same nutritional perspective. We'll have to customize our approach so that the patients who are already at risk, like the patient who was presented to the emergency department, gets maximum benefit and the outcome of surgery improves. I often find this part is the slightly neglected part, as I mentioned earlier. However, the concepts are very simple. So when we start realizing the importance of nutrition, it is not something difficult for us to practice it in a day-to-day affair. It is just the awareness and probably and little motivation that should keep us engaged in attending nutritional risk in patients. So just to put forth various scenarios for a surgery like laparoscopic cholecystectomy, which we commonly perform. We can have a patient who is going to walk into our clinic with symptomatic cholelithiasis, with plan for a daycare laparoscopic cholecystectomy. So these patients are unlikely to have any malnourishment in the preoperative setting, and even in the postoperative setting, they are not likely to undergo any limitation of enteral nutrition. So these patients are at very low risk of malnourishment. Whereas the other patient, we can have a gallbladder perforation with diffuse peritoneal contamination. So these patients who have diffuse peritonitis are likely to undergo surgery and probably be in the ICU for 3 or 4 days to tackle the infection, sepsis, organ support, and the insult of gallbladder perforation, whether it had an impact on the preoperative nutritional intake. So now the process becomes a little more complicated. We are no longer having a patient who is straightforward, but who is going to have a component of malnourishment even in the preoperative setting, and is likely to have an enteral nutrition impeded in the postoperative setting, along with the critical care. We might encounter patients who are having gangrenous cholecystitis with multiple comorbidities. So they might be having a pre-existing ischemic heart disease. They might be already on hemodialysis for chronic kidney disease. Again, when trying to concentrate on their nutritional aspects, these comorbidities cannot be neglected. Again, these have to be pulled in. And as Dr. Valid spoke very nicely, it is not a single person decision. It will be a multidisciplinary approach where even the specialists from these who attend to these comorbidities also get involved in planning the nutrition to these patients. There are a significant subset of patients who had severe acute biliary pancreatitis. So they did go through a period of severe catabolism where they lost weight. They had to undergo critical care in ICU setting. They might have been subjected to various antibiotics. You would then see them in the postoperative settings, probably 6 weeks later, where you are planning for an laparoscopic cholecystectomy. So these patients again are not similar to those patients in the first category. Though right now they are fine, you would have realized that these patients during the period of acute pancreatitis would have undergone severe catabolism, and the resultant sarcopenia will be very evident in these individuals. So we cannot neglect the sarcopenia, and when taking up these patients, it is very prudent that we try to ensure they are already come back to the normal nutritional status. So a patient who is recently recovered from sepsis, who had a period of severe malnutrition, it is not wise to take them up for an elective surgery before they are nutritionally optimized. So that is where, as a surgeon, we need to concentrate on the preoperative nutrition, the nutrition during the immediate postoperative period, as well as in the discharge phase. So we would like to have a stepwise approach in addressing this nutrition. The first step will be the nutritional assessment and the risk stratification of the patients entering our hospital. Then planning the nutrition. The third part will be the administration of nutrition and monitoring of the effects of this nutrition. And finally, to evaluate whether we have reached the targets. So what we can easily identify is the steps are similar to any other drugs that we are going to administer. So for example, we are going to talk about IV antibiotics. So whether a broad spectrum antibiotics required or not, that will be the assessment part of it. Then we need to plan what is the dosage to give. Then we need to administer the drug. Then we need to monitor whether the drug is working or not. So suppose if I am planning for an broad spectrum antibiotic in a patient with severe sepsis, I would like to find out whether the patient is clinically responding with respect to decrease in organ support, with respect to the counts. So those kind of. So nowadays, I think we should consider nutrition part of pharmacological aspect too. So even the branch is now termed as nutraceuticals. It is no longer only nutrition, it is what termed as nutraceuticals. So how do we assess nutrition in our patients? Whom to screen, when to screen, why to screen, and how to screen. So these will be the four topics when you are going to assess the nutrition. Whom to screen and when. So many times what we generally find is those patients who are coming for surgery are screened, but those patients who are actually visiting our OPD are not screened. They are not. They can be of two spectrum. We might have patients who are malnourished because of undernutrition. At the same time, we can also have patients who are overnourished. So the bariatric population are also kind of malnourished, but their correction methods and techniques are going to be different from the way we are going to manage an undernourished patient. So this is a study which was published in 2003 from Nature journal. This is a study that was conducted in Spain, where they tried to subject all the patients who are entered their hospital based on the three scoring systems. That is the subjective global assessment, nutritional risk index, and the instant nutritional assessment. So the reason why I put this chart was, we can find of the patients who are screened, the percentage of proportion of patients who are malnourished existed from somewhere 60 to even going up to 90%. This was based on the various scores that were used, but even the lowest proportion of patients who had a malnourishment that was visible was around 60%. So we can imagine, this is an European study, but I'm sure it will have near normal resemblance across the world, but it can vary across depending upon the population we are planning to study. In India, there have been studies to show that nearly 70% of the individuals who enter the OPD have some amount of malnourishment, and majority are mild in the elective setting and majority and severe in the emergency setting. So I think it is very important for us to screen our own population and identify our own population for nutritional malnourishment, and also have our own risk stratification system. I'll be coming to this later. So why to screen? We know that 70% are going to be malnourished. Why do we need to screen? Because it has an impact on our surgical outcomes. This is a chart which shows about the surgical outcomes in patients who are stratified based on CMUS. C is actually for Chinese, and MUST is for malnutrition under surgery trial. And the outcomes that were studied were length of stay, 30 days mortality, 60 days mortality, and medical complication. So we can find that all were higher, that is the 30-day mortality, 60-day mortality were significantly higher in those patients who were having a high malnutrition risk. So that is the reason we need to screen this population. This is another graph which showed that the weight loss preoperatively actually had a bearing on the length of hospitalization. So more the weight loss that was documented, the longer was the length of hospitalization. I tried to search a few Sudanese studies regarding the nutrition. So this was one which I came across, where they had tried to study the levels of albumin, pre-albumin, and transferrin in patients who are undergoing dialysis. So these are not surgical patients, but just to have an idea what is the incidence of malnourishment in these individuals. Though we couldn't get the exact proportion, the study showed that the transferrin levels were not contributory, whereas the other biochemical parameters, albumin, pre-albumin, and HSCRP were severely deranged in case of an renal disease patients. So how do we monitor nutrition in patients? The two common methods are anthropometric measurements. The second one is the biochemical investigations. Sometimes we don't have an right or wrong answer in both of these. So there are numerous scores that have been devised, which take into account the history, the examination, anthropometry, as well as biochemical parameters to risk stratify individuals. So these are some of the common anthropometric measurements that are being used: weight, height, skin fold thickness to assess the subcutaneous fat, and mid-arm circumference. For those patients who are not walking, like they are not able to get onto a weighing machine, there are devices now where they can be bed lifted. Along with the patient, the underlying sheet is lifted up, which will tell us the weight of the patient. So probably in a critical care patient, we cannot ask them to stand on a weighing machine. So these are places where we can use these devices. Once we know the weight, height, there are some derivatives which we use, which are actually used in calculating the nutritional requirement. Most often, we just try to find out the body mass index, that is the kilogram per height square, weight by height square. But that may not be the true reflection of a patient's nutritional status. The values with respect to the ideal body weight calculation are deemed better, because body mass index can calculating a patient based on body mass index alone may not be appropriate, or true weight alone, because a patient who is obese, if we are going to use the weight as to calculate the nutrition, we might actually overnourish the patient. At the same time, was a patient who has gone into chronic malnourishment, their weight will be very low. So calculating the current nutrition based on the current weight, we might actually under supplement these individuals. So that is why we need to calculate the ideal body weight of the patients, and the nutritional requirement calculation is based on the ideal body weight, not the true weight of the patients. So we have various formulas for it. It generally involves the weight and the height of the individual. So is it the same, a BMI? Why I am a little against BMI is, BMI tells us, gives us like an idea, notion that the higher the BMI, more is the fat, which is not true actually. So the weight of a person is a combination of the bone mass, the muscle mass, the fat mass, and all those factors. This has been beautifully brought out by the YY phenomenon. This, I think, was published in NEJM in the 2000s, where the person on the left is from European and the person on the right is from Indian origin, and both of them have a BMI of 22.3. Both names starts with Y, so that's why it's called YY phenomenon. Despite their BMI being similar, we can find that the percentage of body fat in the Indian is going to be a lot higher. So meaning to say, the Europeans generally have a larger muscle mass. So their BMIs are less likely to get affected by just a change in fat composition. So they need to go into a period of sarcopenia to have a reduction in weight, whereas in Indian is likely to show up a difference in weight just because of decrease in fat composition. So how good is serum albumin in determining the nutritional status of a patient? This is a figure just to demonstrate the factors that can affect serum albumin concentration. An infusion of FFP can increase it, increased insulin administration can increase it, and contraction of vascular compartment can cause a spurious elevation in serum albumin. Similarly, among the factors that can decrease serum albumin include catabolism, renal loss, gut loss, increased capillary permeability, decreased lymphatic return. So all these factors are even more going to be exaggerated in a critically ill patient. That way, the point I would like to highlight is, kindly don't go along alone with serum albumin for assessing a nutritional status of a patient. So are there any other biochemical parameters? Yes, like as the Sudanese study that had uh, hypothesized that the transferrin didn't have a much of difference between the healthy and CKD, whereas prealbumin did have a difference. But again, all these are some kind of an acute phase reactant. So a patient who is going to have, including CRP, who is going to have an inflammatory process that is going to occur, these values are going to be changed apart based on the inflammatory process apart from the nutritional status of the patient. So basing our risk stratification only on these biochemical parameters may not be appropriate. So to overcome this, we have various scoring systems. This is the scoring system that we use in our institute, which is called as the Modified Subjective Global Assessment. The original Subjective Global Assessment was actually, again, started with dialysis patients, but modified, instead of the 10 criteria, the modified has just 7 criteria, which includes an medical history of the patient as well as the clinical examination. In the history, the components that are asked are weight change in the last 6 months, what are the dietary intake, whether there is a reduction or anything, any gastrointestinal symptom, functional capacity, and the metabolic demand, whether the patient was having any other significant comorbidity. Coming to the physical examination, so the fat store and the muscle wasting are the 2 parameters that are studied. With all the relevant history and the physical examination, the score is charted, which can range from 7 to 35. So based on this, patients are classified between 7 to 14, 15 to 28, 29 to 35. So the A category patients are well nourished, B are moderately malnourished, and C are severely malnourished. These assessment is done by our dietitian, and it is done for all the patients who are getting admitted in the hospital. Why? Because those patients in category A may not require any nutritional support. So these patients, if they are going to undergo procedure in their hospital, which is not going to affect their nutrition status for a prolonged period of time, they will just need routine nutrition. There is no requirement to have a support system as such for these individuals. On the contrary, those patients who are categorized in C, they are at high risk individuals. So these patients need utmost care in devising the nutritional plan. So that is the reason these patients are routinely classified, and those patients who are falling under C are routinely visited by our dietitian to ensure that their nutritional requirement is taken care of. So these are the other parameters that are used. Like another scoring system which had BMI, unplanned weight loss, and the amount of nutritional intake for more than 5 days if it's low or not. Based on that, they are again classified. So the importance of scoring systems are to classify patients, to identify at-risk patients, to ensure that their requirements are met, and the pre-existing malnutrition is compensated during the hospital stay. So this is very important, and I think again I would like to emphasize this scoring system should be based on our own population. It should not be coming as a derivative just because it is used by some other country. Coming to, once we have stratified, we have identified patients who are at risk, then comes the nutritional planning. When we plan for a nutrition, there are 2 major routes. One is the enteral, one is the parenteral. So any form of nutrition that is delivered with using the GI tract is called the enteral nutrition. It can be either the normal by mouth feeding or by tube feeding. Tube feeding will include nasogastric tube feeding, PEG tube feeding, jejunostomy tube feeding. So all these are included under forms of enteral nutrition. In those patients who we may not be able to use the GI tract for whatever reason it may be, then we resort to parenteral nutrition. That is, we administer nutrition by IV, intravenously. So having planned so far, I'll just now start moving gradually to parenteral nutrition. So when is preoperative parenteral nutrition actually indicated? This is a universally followed guideline to start patients on preoperative parenteral nutrition. So those patients who are already malnourished, that is like in our calculation in scoring, if the patient falls under the category C, severely malnourished category, plus who are not able to take adequate oral or enteral intake, or a non-functionable GI tract, like an perforated patient or a patient is in obstruction. So these group of patients who are already at risk and are likely to have and persisting low oral intake, these are the patients who will benefit from initiation of parenteral nutrition in the perioperative period. That is, even before surgery, these patients should be considered for parenteral nutrition. Having decided that these are the group of patients who are going to require parenteral nutrition, is it going to be peripheral or going to be the central? So these are the two ways of administering parenteral nutrition. The basic difference between the two formulations will be with respect to the osmolarity. So the carbohydrate content in the central venous formulations are going to be higher, thereby increasing their osmolarity, whereas in the peripheral line is going to be lower, as demonstrated by this table. So it can be administered by IV line, peripheral IV line. Potassium levels are also slightly higher in the central venous. If it is a subjective call when to start peripheral supplementation or when to start central supplementation. Suppose if I am going to have a patient who is going to be wheeled into the OT for an diffuse peritonitis, and I know that patient is already malnourished, I'll probably place the central line during the surgery itself and ensure I use it during the post-operative setting. Or sometimes if a patient is in subacute intestinal obstruction and I'm planning to evaluate the patient, then I might take a call on starting the patient on peripheral nutrition for 1 or 2 days before taking up the patient for surgery. So whichever formulations we use, it is very important that we start it immediately in those patients who are at risk. If we can place a central line safely immediately, then we can start with central line placement. Or if we feel it is going to be a temporary phenomenon, we don't know the exact course that the patient is going to take, whether the patient is going to be taken up for surgery, or the patient probably can undergo some other form of enteral nutrition, then we can just start with peripheral parenteral nutrition and assess periodically to see whether we need to shift to the central venous parenteral nutrition. So these are the various axes by which parenteral nutritions are supplemented. So the one which is placed directly into the right atrium via either the jugular or the subclavian, which we routinely use in our ICU, are called the non-tunneled catheters. In case we are thinking of using it for a longer time, then we tunnel the catheter for some period, some length of the catheter, which is called as a skin tunneled catheter, which reduces the chance of infection. The other way of administering parenteral nutrition are due to through implanted chest port. We can also have a peripherally inserted central catheter, which we are often using nowadays. So these are specifically useful in patients who are planned on home-based parenteral nutrition. So those patients who are not in sepsis, who are hemodynamically stable, but at present are not able to take up have adequate oral intake. So in these patients, we place a peripherally inserted central catheter and we teach them how to administer the nutrition, and we periodically assess. Given its peripherally inserted system, the chances of infection is slightly lower, though I think it cannot be used for more than 3 weeks to 4 weeks. That is the ESPEN guidelines as such, which says about PICC line. So what are the targets that we need to achieve? With respect to the calories, the target is 25 kilocalories per kg of ideal body weight. In patients who are having severe stress, that is those patients who are in multi-organ support, who are having severe acute pancreatitis, probably we can raise the carbohydrate calorie requirement to 30 kilocalories per kg body weight. Then protein intake, routinely we start with 1.2 grams per kg body weight, and it can go up to 1.5. The ratio of the protein, fat, and glucose caloric ratio should be in the form of 20:30:50. To be frank, now we have started moving to the pre-mixed formulation of parental nutrition. But initially, when parental nutrition evolved, we actually made the individual, we bought the individual components, we calculated the requirement of individual component for a given patient, we customized the nutritional component, and then it was mixed in the kitchen, given to the ward, and then the staff had to administer it. So those were the days when the nutrition was compounded. But nowadays we have the pre-mix, which is more or less a good substitute. So what are the advantages of compounded? Earlier was we used to customize it for a patient. But the problem was majorly twofold. One is ensuring the safety, because it now goes through a lot of chain, starting from the person who is going to make the compound, who is going to mix it, and then shifting it to the ward, and then getting it administered. So we have a lot of personals who are involved, which can affect the safety of the nutritional part. The second was the availability. Sometimes I think there are few papers which were published, which indicated that in United States there was a lack of lipid component. So these were all overcome by the premixed. One disadvantage of premix is we cannot have a say on the ratio and the actual requirement for the patient. But it's, I would say, and it's better given the fact that it's slightly safer than the compounded parental nutrition. It can again be supplemental or total. So in case of patients who are going to take nothing by mouth or nothing by enteral route, we need to give entire calorie and protein requirement by means of the parental nutrition. Then it becomes total. For patients who are like planning to be weaned off parental nutrition, they had a period of total parental nutrition. Now they have started taking enteral nutrition. So there will be a period where there is a transition. We'll be having both the enteral nutrition going on as well as the parental nutrition going on. So in those periods, the parental nutrition is termed as supplemental parental nutrition. All these parental nutrition have a shelf life, and typically the premixed bags will have 3 chambers. That is for the fat, amino acid, and the dextrose component. And before mixing, they have a very long shelf life. But once they are mixed, the change in pH, the change in chemical reactions that occur, actually mandates us to complete the utilization of the bag within 24 hours. And in a country like India, where sometimes the temperatures can go up to even 45, 50, the temperature also plays a role. So a patient who is probably in an air-conditioned room at 24 degrees or something, so 24 hours is more or less sufficient. But a patient who is going to be in 45 degrees, 50 degrees in a normal general ward, even 24 hours might be pushing the limits. So this is a video. I just
sorry, sir. Would like to stress on this very important point you have mentioned regarding the safety and of introducing this component and how to prepare it and the availability. And the conditions are similar between Sudan and even India is better than us, much more. Regarding the intralipid storage here in Sudan, we face so many cases who end up with convulsions, with very odd complications after supplementing intralipids. And recently we used to go for amino acids and giving proteins and carbohydrates, where we can give them without using the central line. Here we are very concerned about safety. So we're not going to lose patients because of line sepsis, in spite of strict antiseptic technique we are using. You have mentioned a very important point. We can omit the intralipid or some supplements that can compromise the safety of patients, sir?
Yes, sir. It is very true, sir. The place where I was trained, we used to mix those solutions by our own. So I used to remember those days wearing gloves, ensure that there are no dust nearby, ensure that the bag is clean. See, it starts with the entire setup being sterile. So we are going to give a solution directly into intravenous route, and the solution is a good culture medium for any bacteria to grow. So there is nothing that can be compromised while mixing these components.
Okay. Okay.
So I'll just play this video. So it just shows how these three bags I just wanted to. So we have the three chambers that are placed. So they are not mixed when they are actually given to the ward. So the actual mixing takes place only after the staff ensures that the patient requires it, after written order from the physician or the surgeon, and then the mixing takes place. Because once it mixing occurs, then it's an irreversible step. We need to be careful about the volume of the bag that is being used, because commonly we get is 1 liter, 1.5 liters, and 2 liters. Suppose we are going to administer a patient with 40 ml per hour. So over a period of 24 hours, it is just going to be 960 ml. So we don't require a 2-liter bag that needs to be mixed. Similarly, if a patient is going to require 60 ml per hour as parenteral nutrition, then having 2 1-liter bag is going to be more costly. So the, as you had already mentioned, sir, the multidisciplinary team of the dietitian, as a surgeon, of the staff nurse, who is going to take care of the line as well as with respect to preventing line sepsis, all the components in this team are going to be important in ensuring that we achieve the best outcome for the patient. So these are some of the common formulations that is available in India. The one on the left is from Baxter, which is called oliclonamil, and the one on the right is TNA Peri by OCS Claris. I just put forth because to just show the similarity between the two, but I'll be highlighting certain things later on as well. So how do we monitor parenteral nutrition? The commonest problems we encounter will be with respect to the glycemic status of individual. We can have hyperglycemia in majority of them, but we might have hypo also in certain individuals. We need to be careful about urea creatine, which are once done, we need to ensure that if a patient is on impaired renal function, then we'll have to restrict the volume of parenteral nutrition that is going to be given. A periodical assessment of calcium, magnesium, and phosphorus. The preferable interval in which they are checked is around the first day, third day, and probably weekly thereafter. And liver function again, if possible, every 3 days or at least weekly thereafter in patients who are on chronic parenteral nutrition. So this is something we need to be aware in those patients we are starting parenteral nutrition who have been on chronic malnutrition status. So the severe malnutrition stages or the starving point, the body goes into a phase of catabolism where everything is broken down, and a sudden delivery of glucose containing solution and proteins. The cells start taking up the glucose, and then it now shifts to the aerobic metabolism. So it starts utilizing the potassium, magnesium, and phosphorus from the intravascular compartment. So what happens is, as a resultant, we can have hypokalemia, hypomagnesemia, and hypophosphatemia. And more commonly is thiamine deficiency. So all these form a cluster of refeeding syndrome. So in any patient, just I would like to highlight, in any patient who is going to have a very low body mass index, who is going to have a large, greater than 15% of unintentional weight loss in the last 3 to 6 months, with a component of acute nutritional shortage, with a pre-existing potassium, phosphate, and magnesium. That's the reason I mentioned that we need to monitor before starting the parenteral nutrition. We need to have a baseline value of these electrolytes. So in all these patients, we should be aware of refeeding syndrome, and we should constantly monitor them. In our institute, we initially started with 100 milligram of thiamine bolus in all these individuals before starting parenteral nutrition. But I think studies even recommend up to 300 milligram. So in few patients, we did give 300 milligram as bolus dose of thiamine. But our experience, we have not documented as such whether there is a difference between 100 and 300. So if refeeding syndrome really occurs, then we need to classify the severity of hypophosphatemia and hypomagnesemia and correct them accordingly. So we have oral as well as parenteral preparation in correcting both these mineral deficiencies. So what happens to the trace elements? This is a table which indicates the requirement of trace elements and their the proportion that is required in critical care setting. I just put forth by the side of it another common brand that is available, that is Smof Kabi one, which is from Fresenius Kabi, and a table which shows the composition of parenteral nutrition across the volumes that they give us. We can find none of the trace elements that we mentioned here, chromium, cobalt, manganese, selenium, are available in this formulations. So the reason I wanted to stress upon is any patient who is being supplemented with parenteral nutrition, especially on long term, they will need additional trace element supplementation. So probably in a patient who was previously well nourished and who required parenteral nutrition probably for 4 to 5 days or 1 week maximum, they may not require trace element supplementation. But anyone else, that is those patients who are malnourished even before and or required long-term parenteral nutrition, they will require trace element supplementation as well as vitamin B complex supplementation. So these are some preparations that are quoted. The one on the right, that is Otsky and Salicyl, are those ones which are available in India. How long to continue? So the usual criteria is to ensure that the patient at least consumes 60% of the energy needs by enteral nutrition. Till that time, we need to continue with the parenteral nutrition support. So just to highlight the importance of parenteral nutrition in surgical outcomes, I wanted to show an example. A person, 68 years gentleman, who presented to us with metastatic carcinoma rectum. Patient had a primary asymptomatic upper rectal lesion with T3N plus with a large volume hepatic metastasis, which was bilobar involving both lobes. So patient at the time of diagnosis was asymptomatic from primary. He was taking normal food. His BMI was 27. So if we go by the SGA scoring, modified SGA scoring, he came into the category A. He was subjected to neoadjuvant chemotherapy because his primary was asymptomatic and it was metastatic disease. So before the starting of chemotherapy, these were his anthropometric measurements. BMI was 26.3. He was then subjected to 4 cycles of FOLFOX with bevacizumab and 6 cycles of FOLFOX. So we can see how the BMI has gradually started coming down. What initially started 26.3, by the end of his 6 cycles of FOLFOX, it had almost reached 24 or 23.8, something like that. So just to highlight the effect of chemotherapy on the nutritional status of the patient. The idea of this patient was to, after completion of 6 cycles of FOLFOX, he was supposed to be present for reassessment, where we would like to evaluate and plan for surgery. But unfortunately, that was a time when we started having COVID here. So patient could not meet us for nearly a month and a half. And he developed complete obstruction. So he developed complete intestinal obstruction because of the tumor in upper rectum. So he presented to us after 5 days. He had to travel from another state to our hospital. So that again took us 5 more days. So imagine this patient, an elderly individual who has malignancy involving the GI tract, who had chemotherapy, and the effect of chemotherapy on his nutritional status by means of decreasing BMI is well documented, and now has acute intestinal obstruction and presents to us after 5 days. So all these factors are going to be making him a high risk individual for poor nutritional status. So during the assessment at this admission, patient had a BMI of 22, he had bilateral pedal edema, and he had not taken anything oral for the last 5 days. So he straight away goes to the SGS grade C. So what we did was we took up the patient, we started the patient on parenteral nutrition, peripheral, after giving thiamine and monitoring his baseline phosphorus, potassium, and magnesium. After the COVID test and preparation, since it was subacute, we took him up the next day. It took us 36 hours. So at that time, we placed a central line, anticipating the requirement of parenteral nutrition in the post-operative period. He underwent an low anterior resection with an loop ileostomy. So post-operatively, patient was started on parenteral nutrition. He was watched for refeeding, and it was gradually increased. The rice tube was removed on POD 4 itself, 5, but he had to be reinserted because patient started developing bilious vomiting. So he didn't conform to the usual recovery phase, which we somehow expected given his status presentation. The stoma never started functioning. It was always producing 50 to 75 ml. The abdomen was distended. The stoma was healthy. The electrolytes were normal. So we tried to manage him conservatively. We did a CT at the end of POD 8, POD 7. The features were suggestive of adhesive changes with gross dilatation of small bowel. Then we tried some prokinetic, gave him some contrast to see whether that can resolve the subacute obstruction, but it never resolved. So till POD 9, patient didn't have the stoma properly functioning, and he was completely dependent on parenteral nutrition for his nutritional support. So these are his lab parameters. We can find the electrolytes were more or less maintained appropriately. The albumin started showing a downward trend. So this is what I wanted to highlight. Here the albumin is lowered because of multiple reasons. It is not because patient, despite having parenteral nutrition, is going into malnutrition. It is because now we have resuscitated him volume wise. Patient is still in a catabolic phase. So all those things will start hampering the serum albumin. So the albumin level alone should not be taken into consideration while assessing the nutritional status. So in POD 9, patient was re-explored. There were dense interbowel additions, but there was no collection. So patient just had an adhesiolysis. Patient was continued with the conservative measures. We continued on parenteral nutrition. We tried to give him some prokinetics, ensure he walks better, chest physiotherapy. And what we did notice some elevation in his alkaline phosphatase, which is very characteristic of cholestasis induced by parenteral nutrition. So once this started developing, this is due to the lipid component in the parenteral nutrition, and it is somewhat anticipated in those patients who are going to be on longer parenteral nutritional support. We started him on ursodeoxycholic acid. So finally, patient started moving his bowel. The stoma started functioning in POD 20, and we removed the rice tube. Started orals the 2 days later. And then after 3 days, he was able to tolerate more than 70% of his requirement. So we stopped the parenteral nutrition. So this case I just put forward to make us realize the importance of nutrition. See, this patient didn't have sepsis, didn't have a collection, didn't have organ failure, didn't require critical care. There was no major infective foci that probably explained why he had a very bad post-operative period. But still, without the parenteral nutrition, the outcome is likely to have been otherwise. We could not have anticipated for a patient who has so much high risk for malnutrition. Till POD 20, he could not have even small amounts of nutritional intake by mouth. So if not for parenteral nutrition, I don't think we could have salvaged this patient. So luckily, patient responded finally, and we also had the availability of parenteral nutrition. So he got discharged and he was reviewed. He's doing fine. So finally, just take home, nutrition should be part of the treatment. I think like how we are trying to concentrate on importance of evaluating a patient by investigation, how we are trying to refine our surgical techniques. I think the choice of IV antibiotics we are using in sepsis control, the organ support system that has evolved over years, nutrition also plays a very important role which has improved the surgical outcomes. So it can make a big difference in determining the outcome. Yes, parental nutrition has its downside like cost, availability, and side effects, but it can definitely help us in tiding our crisis, like the one case we just saw today. Uh,
Thank
you,
you
sir.
very much, Dr. Gosan. Any question? Anyone has a burning question to ask? Any question, please? Um, so, dear Dr. Gosan, thank you for this very valuable lecture. And do you recommend you have displayed the scores that you need to assess and the risk stratification of patients? Do you recommend using nutritional supplements, especially total parenteral nutrition for patients who cannot feed them earlier, to give them total parenteral nutrition, like patients who are going for a esophagectomy, total gastrectomy, and they are group A? According to the score, there is no nutritional needs. But for the rapid enhanced recovery, you recommend giving such patients nutritional supplies?
So I think that's a very valid question, sir. Like esophagectomy, total gastrectomy, Whipple's procedure. So these are patients, even if they are in category A, and early nutritional support in these individuals is likely to have a better outcome. Generally, what we practice is to perform a feeding jejunostomy in all these conditions: esophagectomy, total gastrectomy, as well as in Whipple's. And we start enteral nutrition, that is tube feeding, the very next day, and probably by fourth day we reach the requirement. I personally believe, I think there are also studies to show, and when enteral nutrition is available, parental nutrition is going to lead to an increased inflammatory processes. So wherever we are anticipating like these three procedures which are likely to get complicated and patient can have prolonged periods of starvation, it is better to perform a feeding jejunostomy rather than relying on parental nutrition in these individuals. So I personally believe that as a surgeon during surgery, we need to be a little more aware. And if it's, even if there's a slightest of doubt that this patient is not going to, may require nutritional support in the postoperative period, it's better to perform a feeding jejunostomy, which can help us in administering enteral route rather than starting parental nutrition. So an early enteral nutrition will be my preferred choice in these individuals. In case and feeding jejunostomy is not done for some reason or the other, I like to wait for at least POD5, POD4-5, because as per guidelines, what is recommended is if the patient is not able to take adequate nutrition by the end of 7th day. So by 5th day, we like to know. We would probably know whether this patient on 7th day is going to have the normal diet or is not going to reach the requirement. So that call, I think I will take on POD 4 or 5, whether to start on parental nutrition, but not earlier than that.
we do you recommend extra care for the central line? You're providing with it the any design protocol for administration of total parenteral nutrition by the central lines? Do you stress on it while when you use the total parenteral nutrition?
Sir, whenever we plan to use the central line for parental nutrition, one port is always marked for parental nutrition. That port is never used for administering any other medicines, including organ support medicines like vasopressors. And the sister who is going to, staff nurse is going to maintain that port is going to play a very vital role, because like not so careful handling of the system actually provides a very good nidus for infection. So we actually mark that port with a tape indicating that is going to be the parental nutrition, and we tell the staff nurse that is only that port that is going to be used for parental nutrition. Once the parental nutrition bag is completed, uh, just 2 or 3 hours before itself, the staff nurse has to talk to the physician as well as to the dietitian whether further nutrition is required or not, parental nutrition, and if so, the bag is indented and it is brought to the bedside. Because sometimes what we find is the bag is over and then the process of indenting starts, so that delays the process by another 2 to 3 hours. So all these things play an important role when we decide to give it via central line.
Welcome, Professor Sulaiman. Hussein.
Good evening, sir. I think sir is not. Sir, there is a question in the chat box. Can I just read? What is the recommended infusion rate for both parental and central total parental nutrition? The common formulations we have, we go up to a rate of 40 to 50 ml per hour in the peripheral parental formulation, whereas in case of central formulations, we can go even up to 70. But anything more than 60 is generally avoided because of the high lipid content in the central TPN. So invariably, it will fix up, like what I have seen is when we calculate for a patient and we start administering in a peripheral parental nutrition, a peripheral preparation, we go up to 50. In a central, we go up to 60, 65. It is never more than this.
Dear sir, there are so many different schools regarding the components administration. A little bit confusing. Some they are using the intralipid during night, and they are keeping the amino acids and carbohydrates during the daylight. Thinking of the basal metabolic rate that should be supported by the amino acids to keep it for building, and the intralipid and sugars for energy. So many confusing things about the way of administration of the components before the premix. Any supportive data for this?
Sir, it's again a valid question, sir. The earlier dictum was there are few, I wouldn't say myths actually, but there are certain the schools of knowledge which told we'll need to give intralipid during the night, and the amino acid concentration, the glucose concentration has to be lower in those patients who are on ventilator, because they believe a patient who is given high caloric IV supplementation in the form of high carbohydrate and intra lipid, they are likely to generate more CO2. So more carbon dioxide retained, they are likely to be on ventilator for a longer time. So these are called as hypercaloric feeds. There were a lot of issues when people started thinking that hypercaloric feeds lead to prolonged ventilation and poor recovery. But I think it's no longer supplemented. Like I think there are studies in JAMA surgery in 2012 which came across and told it has no problem in giving hypercaloric feed. So even if patient is given hypercaloric feed for a brief period of time, does not worsen the outcome of the patient. So the timing of intralipid and these things, I think the data initial guidelines, actually guidelines never spoke about them. It was more of a practice that it was followed. Given now the premix being the standard of care, I think no longer we are discussing about them. We never followed that intralipid being given in the night and dextrose given in the morning and amino acid. So we never followed it, to be frank. So there's one question. Can you expand the indications of parenteral nutrition? Yeah. So parenteral nutrition is indicated in any patient who is going to have not have appropriate enteral nutrition by the end of 7 days. That is the most important indication. So even a patient who has come for lab chole, some who had bile duct injury and had a bile leak and everything, or a duodenal injury for which patient is not able to take orally or those things, even in those cases, you can wait up to 7 days. But at the end of 5 days, if you feel patient is not going to have nutritional intake of at least 60% at the end of day 7, I would prefer the patient is being started on parenteral nutrition. So the decision will be on 5th day in case of a patient who is already doing fine. In a patient who is already malnourished, an earlier parenteral nutrition will be instituted. That is the timing. But the indication is 7 days. That is something we need to be very careful. Routinely administering parenteral nutrition in patients who are already doing fine can be detrimental. So a lab chole patient who is going to be there for 2 days in the hospital doesn't require a parenteral nutrition. For them, enteral nutrition is more than something. So we should not misuse parenteral nutrition. At the same time, we should not miss a chance to use parenteral nutrition when it is indicated. How long can we use central route? The usual is 14 days. There are studies which started changing central lines after 7 days if they have been used for parenteral nutrition. But if there are no evidence of central line sepsis, then we can go up to a period of 14 days. After 14 days, irrespective of whether there is an evidence of central line infection or not, we need to change the site of central line infection. So that is where we start evolve. We have started evolving to placing tunneled catheters to PICC line, because PICC line can be used even up to 3 weeks to 4 weeks. There is something called as Hoffman's catheter which can be used even up to 3 months. So a patient who is in home-based parenteral nutrition, total parenteral nutrition for say something like a short bowel syndrome, we can place those kind of special catheters so that we can have the maximum days for which they can be used. So I think I answered that question. So anything else? Reference, I think the very good thing about reading is probably source will be from ESPEN guidelines, which have clear-cut data for critically ill patients, for surgical patients. So it's very good for home-based TPN. ESPEN guidelines is something I think we can read from. The second, if book needs to be quoted, I think Sabiston is good.
one question, sir. When do you introduce the microelements? Suppose I start the total parenteral nutrition at day 2 postoperatively or the 3 according to risk. When should I supply the micro elements? And we have seen patients with demyelination, refeeding syndrome, where we search for thiamine pure to introduce in a high dose, but we failed and we start by neuropene and then find it. So when should we start the microelements? When do you recommend that?
Sir, if the patient is already malnourished, like in our patient, I would probably start the micronutrient supplementation from day 1 of parenteral nutrition. And as I mentioned earlier, definitely thiamine loading dose is something I believe will change the outcomes. I have seen patients with refeeding syndrome, they have thrown seizures and whatnot. So I think it is better to be in preventive rather than an reactive way. And if the patient is already doing fine, patient preoperatively was in good nutritional status, then we can wait up to a period of 7 days. I think trace elements, we can wait up to a period of 7 days before we think of supplementing them. In case patient still requires parenteral nutrition, I think that is the time we start supplementing with trace elements.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much for your time and for this valuable lecture. And hope to hear from you soon and to listen for your valuable knowledge. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much for the opportunity.